Testing one. Cool. Thank you again for having me. Doesn't seem to be working. Can you just switch it manually? Oh, okay. Stupid me. Cool. Thanks. Cool. So a few of you guys asked me not last week, the week before, to share a little bit about my ministry in particular. Thank you for asking about that. So as you can see up there on the board, you can see me witnessing to a couple of different people on this slide. On the left is a gentleman named Sally, whom I spoke to at King George Square. He's one of, I spoke to him not last year, but the year before that. Oh, sorry. He spoke to him the beginning of last year. He misunderstood the gospel. He came from a culturally Christian background, went to an African Pentecostal church, very interesting. He misunderstood the gospel and he didn't know which religion was true. I explained the gospel and the evidence for Christianity, and it really went really well. Sally said at the end of the conversation, "This has low-key changed my life." On the right is McLaughlan. I spoke to him outside the uni at QUT Gardens Point. McLaughlan grew up as a Christian, but his faith was mostly the influence from his friends and church community. He said he hadn't rarely believed in Christianity for himself. He indicated during our conversation that he was about to leave Christianity. He said he actually thought I was an atheist. Thankfully, I was not. And he thought I was going to be the nail that hit the Hannah's, the saying. And he said, he admitted, he said, "Oh no, this is the end." Thankfully, that's not what happened. So I explained the gospel to him. He understood the gospel, but he didn't know why Christianity should be true. So I explained the evidence for Christianity to him. He said that talking to me was a key turning point for him. It's sort of conversations like that keep me going, and why I know this is actually a valuable thing that I'm doing. If you're interested in what I do, you can use this QR code. It takes you to a link to a webpage which you can use to sign up for my newsletter. I think that's, and then you can hear update stories once a month and know how my ministry is going. As an evangelist with OAC Ministries, I've had literally hundreds of conversations with people about the gospel. While the vast majority of these conversations are civil, every now and again I speak to someone who is rude. It happens. I've even had a conversation where the person I'm talking to is only interested in mocking me or Christianity. I could count them on one of my hands, but it does happen. Their idea is of fun is to mock the faith that we hold dear. My experience is not unique. I've heard many painful stories from other Christians. I know people whose faith is constantly mocked in their workplace or experience constant friction with family members who make it clear that they think Christianity is either stupid or evil. We've all seen how Christians are constantly slandered in Hollywood and on the news. This is our reality. I know if I go around this room today and ask you particularly about your own stories, I'm sure I'd find a lot of painful stories about how following Christ has cost you dearly. I'm not saying it's not worth it, but there is pain there. Thankfully, in Australia, we're blessed to have some measure of religious freedom. It's not like, as we heard in prayer earlier, we're probably not going to die for it. We might be harassed by our faith, but unlike in Nigeria or the Middle East, it's very unlikely we would ever be killed for it. Peter was writing to various churches in Turkey, various churches in an area we call today Turkey. These Christians were living to a pretty similar situation than we do now. No one was being threatened with death for being a Christian. They weren't being threatened to throw to the lions. Wasn't happening. They weren't coated in wax and turned into torches, like I think it was Nero did it in Rome. Pretty horrendous. They weren't given the choice of recanting Christ or dying as martyrs. That was not their struggle. Instead, they faced the same sort of hostility and persecution that many of us experience in our daily lives here in Brisbane. Maybe to a greater degree, but they were experiencing that. They endured insults and mockery in the public square. They were slandered, despised, and mistreated. They suffered hostility because they were Christians. And Peter was reminding them how they need to respond to this hostility. They needed to respond with courage, not fearing those who mocked them, but honouring God. They needed to be prepared to give evidence for their belief in Christianity and do so that is both gentle and obedient to God. It's helpful to break down these verses into 4 key insights on how to be a good witness when we're being mocked for our faith. Our sermon today will be structured around these 4 key insights. These insights are as follows. Good witnesses fear mockers. Good witnesses fear rightly. Good witnesses are prepared. Good witnesses are godly. And good witnesses shame mockers. Let me repeat that. Good witnesses fear rightly. Good witnesses are prepared. Good witnesses are godly. And good witnesses shame mockers. Let's get started by looking at verse 14. It says, "But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord." These verses disclose to us the first thing that we need to remember for witnessing to Christ in a hostile world, in a hostile culture. It's that good witnesses fear rightly. In verse 14, Peter is actually paraphrasing an amazing verse from Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet in the kingdom of Judah. During the times of Isaiah was prophesying, the armies of Syria and Israel were seeking to depose King Ahaz of Judah by force and install their own puppet ruler. The people of Judah were, in some sense rightly, afraid of this mighty coalition of forces of both Israel and Syria, who were threatening wars against them. Pretty scary, some massive armies. Judah and their king would end up relying on the king of Assyria for military support to protect them from Israel and Syria rather than trusting in the promise of God, in direct disobedience to God. He told them to trust in him. This would result in their destruction when Assyria betrayed them. But prior to that destruction, God warns Isaiah not to be like those who are afraid of Israel and Syria, because he will be a sanctuary to those who trust in him, but he will utterly destroy people who trust in finite humans instead. Therefore, if Isaiah is going to survive, he must trust in God rather than mere human beings. Rather than fearing men, Isaiah must fear God Almighty. Rather than fearing the leaders of human armies, Isaiah should fear the one who commands the myriad of mighty angels in the armies of heaven. Please look with me at Isaiah 8, verses 11 to 13. This is what the Lord says to me with his strong hand upon me, warning me to follow the ways of this people. Do not call conspiracy everything that this people calls conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, and do not dread it. And here comes the part that Peter is paraphrasing. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. He will be a holy place for both Israel and Judah. He will be a stone that causes them to stumble and a rock that causes them to fall. And for the people of Jerusalem, he will be a trap and snare. This passage means that honouring God means fearing him rather than our opponents. God is strong and mighty. And in comparison to his great might, the people hostile to us because of our faith are like grasshoppers. They should be of no account to us. It's not that we should never be afraid, but that we should fear the right person. People are often... before I get to the illustration, I'm preaching this as much to myself as to others. I struggle with fear all the time. Some people find this encouraging. As I mentioned, I do evangelism as my job. I volunteered for 18 months before I started that role. And it was only at the end of the 18 months that I was willing to have a conversation with someone on my own, because I was so afraid of evangelism. You know, I would screw up or something. Like, I was really afraid. I know how frightening it can be to talk to someone about your faith. So just know that I realize how hard this is. People are often so afraid of some danger that in trying to avoid it, they actually end up hurting themselves rather than avoiding the real danger. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many people were afraid of catching COVID. They didn't actually seek medical treatment. This happened even when people experienced symptoms of stroke and heart disease. Imagine you feel like your heart's being squeezed. You can't breathe properly and you want to vomit. You think you might have a heart attack, but you're not sure. You're scared to go to the hospital because COVID's pretty frightening, and you think people might have it. You decide to stay at home. A lot of people thought exactly like this, and unfortunately it led to their deaths. They feared catching COVID more than they feared catching heart disease. They feared the wrong thing, and it cost them their lives. By the way, before I wrote this illustration, I did not know Felix had COVID. The righteous fury of God should scare us more than people who mock our faith. It's a great dishonour to God when we, rather than relying on his fatherly care, allow ourselves to be overcome with terror at the people we're talking to. When we are confronted with those who mock our faith, we should realise that we should have nothing to fear from them. Fearing God in the face of such mockery is essential to witnessing to Christ in a hostile world. If you don't fear God more than them, you won't do it. Our very souls can be at risk if we fail to fear God rather than man. Jesus once said, "Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven." Now, that probably That probably won't happen to you guys. It may happen. But even if we don't deny Christ outright, out of fear, we may refuse to speak up when we should have. I know there's times when I've done that. Or we could cause others to have a lower view of Jesus. Or because we're afraid of other finite people. That would be deeply shameful. The second thing we need to remember when witnessing to Christ in hostile culture is good witnesses are prepared. In verse 15, Peter says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who has a reason to us to give the reason for the hope that you have. Peter's envisioning in verse 15 spontaneous opportunities, perhaps in the marketplace, at work, or during social events, where believers might be asked questions about their faith. He wants to be ready and prepared so they can provide thoughtful answers when asked why they believe in Christianity. Now, in the way of example, I think God just gave to me, on the way here to this church, I sat in an Uber. I met a guy who's very new agey, very, very wacky beliefs, as he said. I know a little bit about that, and I was able to give some arguments against New Age ideas. I think that's just a wonderful example of just spontaneous witnessing to others. Now, I want to discuss something with the person. I want you to discuss something with the person sitting next to you. Imagine you're chatting with colleagues during lunch break. One of your non-Christian colleagues asks you in a derisive tone a couple of questions. I'm going to give you 15 seconds. Each, and then I'll ask you to switch. So go now. Okay, switch. Cool. Yeah. So, cool. The reason why I do that is I just want to make you think, like, oh, how would I respond in this scenario? It's not super important whether or not you'd be able to give an answer. If you do realize that you don't feel like you could give an answer in this scenario, that's a good sign. That you probably need to do some learning there. It'd be helpful. I encourage you to do your own personal apologetic studies. There's many wonderful resources online from various ministries, such as Apologia Studios or Answers in Genesis. Christian apologists on YouTube like David Wood or Gary Habermas also provide some excellent videos. These organizations and individuals offer an abundance of engaging content to explore. It's endless. I suggest you research and master one argument for Christianity that you find helpful. For example, I chose to look at the historical evidence for the resurrection. I did my research, I memorized key points, and it paid major dividends when sharing my faith. I can, when I'm talking to someone, confidently present one compelling case to anyone I meet. And it's much better to just do one argument that you can really perfect than learning 1,000. Most people don't have time to learn 1,000. Anyway. The third thing we need to remember for witnessing to Christ in a hostile culture is that good witnesses are godly. Peter says in verse 16, "But to do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience." We need to be gentle when sharing our faith. This means not being harsh with those we're witnessing to. When we're mocked and reviled, we need to respond in love rather than kindness. That might sound easy, but when you've got someone right there mocking you, it can be very, very hard not to respond badly. I've certainly responded to people in very unloving ways in the last 4 years that I've been doing evangelism. There's been some times where I've been very disrespectful. But the more and more we need to improve in being loving and kind to those who criticize us. Peter doesn't just say that we need to be gentle, though, when sharing our faith. He also says, as the NIV puts it, we need to have respect. To understand where Peter is saying here, it might be helpful to know that respect might be a misleading translation. The Greek word behind respect is phobos, literally mean fear. The NIV translate this word as respect because the NIV translators understand Peter as saying our response should be respectful to those who ask questions. And quite a lot of people think that's what the passage means. I certainly think that it's true that we need to respect those who inquire about our faith. However, I don't think it's likely that kind of respect is the fear Peter is talking about in this verse. Since Peter has just been talking about fearing God in verse 15, I believe the fear he is referring to is the fear of the Lord. This is the kind of fear Christians have when they understand God is a good father who disciplines his children. And they want to avoid coming under his chastisement. For this reason, I think a better translation would be something like reverence, which is what the NASB uses. They probably agree with me in what the passage means. When we share our faith, we ought to do it in a way that is obedient to God, in a way that shows reverence to him. We must keep God's commandments rather than breaking them when witnessing to others. Sometimes Christians, just like unbelievers, can invent creative ways to sin against God. We can turn even obeying God's commands to provide evidence for our beliefs into sin. Sometimes Christians try to win arguments through deception, speaking harshly to those who ask sincere questions, or harm their neighbours in other subtle or creative ways. But often people see through these tactics, and it even just hardens their heart to the truth even more. While such methods win a debate, they ultimately lose the battle for people's hearts. And it's not just Christians who do this. Others do it too. Some people from other religions try to win converts through manipulative or misleading arguments. It's often easier to notice in others sin in this way, and it's harder to see it in ourselves. For example, many Muslims argue that you should believe in Islam because the Quran contains miraculous scientific knowledge that's only now been discovered by modern science. What an argument. To support this, they often take various verses out of context and make it sound scientific. Imagine you're debating a Muslim and he says, you should believe in Islam because the Quran miraculously revealed that iron was sent down from the sky, something we only know now to be true since modern science tells us that iron comes down to the earth through meteorites. That's their argument. At first, this might sound impressive, but suppose you look up the passage in the Quran and you find the context includes a list of things that God has sent down, such as revelation and prophets. If you took this verse literally, you would also have to believe that the prophets and revelation come down from outer space, which is clearly not what the passage means. Anyone reading this verse in context would realize the Muslim you spoke to has twisted its meaning. His argument is deceptive. He might have been deceived and truly thinks that's what the verse means, but someone at some point was being deceptive. Now ask yourself this. How would this experience affect your views of the Islamic position in arguments? Would you be more inclined to trust their arguments, or are you going to be more skeptical? I know I am more skeptical. Here's the things. Christians sometimes do the same thing. Some Christians twist scriptures to make similar deceptive claims, such as saying the Bible reveals the first and second laws of thermodynamics, the expansion of the universe, or other scientific insights. But if you go and read these texts in context, it becomes clear that they don't reveal anything actually scientific. Christians using these arguments are sinning by being deceptive. Now, a thing in logic, just because a position is true, I think there's really good arguments for Christianity being true. One of the things you learn if you study logic is just because a position is true doesn't mean every argument someone uses for that position is true. In fact, some of them can be actually really bad. I think that is that example that Christians sometimes use. It's the exact same thing the Muslims are using. When we share our faith in an obedient manner, we need to have a clear conscience. The conscience is this God-given faculty that allows us to evaluate our moral actions. A clear conscience is one that is not aware of any unrepentant sin. We should have no reason to feel guilty about the manner in which we share our faith. With a clear conscience, we can have a boldness as we share the gospel because we know the way we are sharing our faith is one worthy of the gospel. If I go out on the street and I am lying to people in my apologetic arguments, I can't have confidence in that because, they can come up with me and challenge me. And if I'm speaking falseness, I might be able to convince some people, but there's going to be people who know more and know that I'm actually faking it. The final thing we need to remember when witnessing to Christ in a hostile culture is that good witnesses shame mockers. When we are obedient to God and treat people with gentleness, we shame those who mock our godly behaviour. Peter says, so those who speak maliciously against your good behaviour in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. When we return good for evil, those who slander us will be put to shame. Peter doesn't get this idea from nowhere. It's actually a concept taught earlier in the Bible in places like Proverbs 25, 21 to 22. Which says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will keep burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to have burning coals on your head. You feel a sharp, excruciating pain on the top of your head. You feel the pain of your skin being torn open, and your nerves screaming from second and third degree burns. You're smelling the burning of flesh and hair. Really horrible, horrible experience. Solomon says this is the kind of pain, the shames someone experiences when they receive blessings from their enemies. When we respond to mockery with gentleness, mockers are humiliated. They realize they have reviled your goodness, and they want the ground to swallow them up whole. One of the purposes of providing reasons for why we believe in Christianity to mockers in a gentle and obedient manner is that they'd be ashamed from their scoffing. Sometimes people don't actually need a logical argument. They actually just need to be humbled. Now, you need to do that with a lot of grace, and it can be difficult to do it right. But actually, it's that shame that can help someone be sobered up. Just like a drunk being sobered up by, right practices. When we are gentle to those who are mocking us, we can cause them to realize their folly by shaming them in that way. Let me end today in prayer. Father, thank you for the wisdom you have given us in your word, and for the way your commandments are a light to our feet. Especially today, I want to thank you for how your word guides us in witnessing to others about your Son and the wonderful gift of salvation, even in the midst of a hostile culture. Forgive us for the times we have been harsh with those who mock us, and for when we have been foolish in speaking to outsiders. It is out of the heart that the mouth speaks, so I ask you to transform our hearts, make them full of gentleness and love rather than harshness and disobedience. I ask that you grant us a deep fear of you, that we may stay on the right path and not remain silent about your gospel. Please grant us the wisdom to provide arguments for the truthfulness of Christianity. Amen. Thank you very much for having me.